Good morning, Heartland. It's great to be with you again. If you're just visiting, by the way, we've started a series called From Ruin to Restoration, where we've been looking at the book of Nehemiah and just looking at how God used Nehemiah to bring restoration to a people that were internally, emotionally, and spiritually ruined. And in the book of Nehemiah, we see that this process of renewal and restoration was really seen in the rebuilding of the exterior walls of Jerusalem. As they repaired the walls, God was simultaneously repairing their hearts. And so today is going to be the last message in this series, From Ruin to Restoration. And so before we go on too much further, let me just give you a brief recap of where we've been. We started off this series talking about how God can make it better through you, that you might actually be the miracle that your context needs. When we look at Nehemiah's life, he was a cup bearer, basically a royal bartender, if you will. It was a position of trust and significance, but at the same time, he was replaceable. And yet God used him and brought him to Jerusalem to do his work. And it was in a valley where he received the vision. And so we talked in the second week about the vision in the valley, meaning that there is a good plan for your life. God has a good plan for you, a plan filled with hope, a plan filled with purpose and expectation. But more than likely, this plan will start in your valley. It might even start with pain and suffering. And just because it starts there doesn't mean it will end there. That even if you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, God can still bring you through. And that's why in the following week, we talked about an inconvenient commitment, meaning your greatest or most important tasks more than likely will not require you to make a 100% commitment or a 100% sacrifice. Rather, it'll be a consistent yet inconvenient commitment over time. For example, if you want to, get healthy and work out, don't squeeze in every workout for the year in 2 days. You'll kill yourself. Rather, it's that consistent though inconvenient commitment to eat right, to sleep right, to work out regularly. And it's really this consistent but inconvenient commitment that paves the way for you to experience all the great things that God has in store for you. But last week, we talked about when you answer the call, expect a brawl, meaning that the good work that God has in store for you is probably going to be a fight, because things worth fighting for are usually a fight. And in this context, it was a fight, but the question is, what were they really fighting for? In the book of Nehemiah, they were, yes, building toward rebuilding their home, that exterior wall of Jerusalem. But God was also rebuilding a sense of inner restoration, a sense of inner renewal. Another word you can use is revival. Now, if those words seem foreign to you, let me word it this way. Have you ever longed for the kind of inner healing that brings hope, peace, joy, and love to you and to your community? For example, maybe you're the parent who works hard, but when you come home, even though, everyone loves you, but when you come home, it just doesn't take much for you to lose your cool. And so a home that was once filled with joyfulness and playfulness and happiness and joy is all of a sudden filled with fear or frustration and anger. And they love you, but you know that you need healing on the inside for you and for the people around you. Maybe you're in a great relationship, but you just can't seem to find true joy. And so by accident, you just keep saying hurtful things about yourself, about others, maybe to that person you desperately care about. And God only knows why. But they still love you and they're still with you. But you know that you need healing on the inside for you and for the people around you. And I think we all know that your external impact in people's lives, in your relationships, in your homes, in your marriage, in your friendships, is directly proportional to your inner health. Your wife, your husband, your children, your parents, your friends, they don't need you to be rich or beautiful or gifted beyond measure. They need you to be healthy, both for your own sake and for the sake of everyone around you. And this idea of inner health doesn't just apply to us individually. It doesn't just apply to us corporately. It doesn't just apply to, us as a family, but it also applies to us as a church. Churches need to have healthy people and healthy families. In fact, It's an interesting rhetorical question because ideally it'd be great to have both. But it'll be interesting to see what you think when you see this question. What would be more impactful for the kingdom? A $300 million budget or 300 healthy Christians? You can put your answer in the comments if you want. I mean, it's a rhetorical question. Like, just so you know, we are actually in the middle of making budgets right now. And for those of you who call Heartland home, you're a member, you'll see those budgets at our annual church business meeting. And please don't misunderstand this quote. The truth is, we need you to give. I give. Our family gives. We need you to give. And by the way, let me just say thank you for your faithfulness. Your giving is the reason we're even here today. Your giving is the reason that we've come this far. And I'm convinced that God will use your financial faithfulness to take this church further and do more than we ever thought possible. But in this rhetorical question, it really does suggest something. It suggests that inner health is one of the greatest gifts you can give. Beyond money, beyond time, beyond material possessions, that a healthy you is the greatest gift you can give your family. A healthy you is the greatest gift you can give your church. A healthy you is one of the most powerful things that God can use in this city. But, how do you get healthy? In this text, how did God's people get healthy? This restoration that people were experiencing in the book of Nehemiah in chapter 8, which we'll read portions of in a second, this restoration affected so many families that it ended up changing an entire nation. Could you imagine God's hope, God's love and peace and joy transforming so many families that it radically changes our communities, even our city, not because of a law that was passed, but because the presence of God came and touched our hearts with his hope, his peace, his joy, and his love. But how did it happen? Well, let's read about it. We're going to read selected portions from chapter 8, starting in verse 1, and here's what it says. All the people came together as one in the square before the water gate, and they told Ezra, really important, they told Ezra, the teacher of the law, to bring out the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded for Israel. Now, just a couple of points of clarification. When Cyrus, the emperor of Persia, released the Jews came back in 3 waves. The last wave, we think is the last wave, but the last wave, recorded wave anyway, was under the leadership of Nehemiah. And the second wave was under the leadership of Ezra the priest. And Ezra was continuing his priestly duties during Nehemiah's leadership. Now, in this context, there was no printing press. People didn't have a Bible. I have one right over here. That was not their context. And so it would not have been rare or out of the ordinary for Jews to have never heard the public reading of the law, the first 5 books of Moses. And so that's kind of some historical points to note. But what's an interesting personal or theological point to note is this, that they told Ezra, this is not the priest or the pastor begging or imploring people, come and listen to God's word, come and pray. This renewal at this point in time is now being birthed from the bottom up. And so on the first day of the 7th month, Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly, which was made up of men and women and all who were able to understand it. Ezra, the teacher of the law, stood on a high wooden platform built for the occasion. Now, interesting, they didn't just ask, but they prepared their hearts to receive, and that internal preparation was evidenced by their external preparation. It wasn't about a pulpit or a podium. It was really an external picture that their hearts were truly ready to receive. And so then Ezra began to read the law, and then Nehemiah the governor, Ezra the priest, and the teacher of the law, and the Levites who were instructing the people said to them all, this day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn or weep. For all the people had been weeping as they listened to the words of the law. Many of them had heard the stories of the past. They had heard at some point, in some capacity, even if it was a fractured capacity, the words of the Jewish Old Testament. But before this time, maybe for the first time in a long time, these words penetrated their hearts and they realized it's not God's fault. It's not the government's fault. It's not my neighbor's fault. It's me. It's me. I'm the reason we're here. And it's that sobering awareness that is hard, isn't it, at times? In fact, it reminds me when I got married and we started having children. And if my parents are watching, this, they love to hear it whenever I talk about this. But, as we started having children, I started to remember all the advice they gave me when I was younger. And as a young person, I didn't listen. And now that I'm older, I realize, wow, I had made some pretty big mistakes. Wow, I had been on the wrong track for a long time. And I remember, holding our newborn children and going, oh my goodness, the trouble I caused my parents. And you kind of have that similar sobering awareness. Oh my goodness, it's me. I can't blame my family. I can't blame my spouse. I can't blame my kids. I can't blame my parents. I can't blame my neighbors. I can't blame my government. It's me. It's me. And so Nehemiah said, they're mourning, but he goes, no. Go and enjoy choice food and sweet drinks and send some to those who have nothing prepared. This day is holy to our God. Do not grieve, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. And then later on in verse 18, it says this, day after day, from the first day to the last, Ezra read from the book of the law of God. They celebrated the festival called the Festival of Tabernacles. We'll talk about it in a moment. For 7 days, and on the 8th day, in accordance with the regulation, there was an assembly. But this was more than just a 7-day party. It was more than just a religious service. Their celebration was the result of their inner restoration, but only because they made space for words of truth, life, and grace. In this series called From Ruin to Restoration, this is the moment that it's happening, or it's at least becoming externally evident that restoration is starting to happen, but only because of this. And you really need to hear this. The restoration is starting to manifest. It's starting to affect families. It's starting to affect children. It's starting to affect marriages, but because of this, their souls were stirred by the word they heard. Their souls were stirred by the word they heard. As you know, I'm a pastor, and one of the things I love to do is just research and read about church culture and what's happening. And right now, as you know, because of COVID-19, there's a lot of change in the air, and there is a lot of conversation about what churches need to do, what churches need to be in order to maximize their impact in our context, both globally and locally for us as the GTA. And I want you to know, I am really thankful for all the wisdom out there. And the truth is, we are going to implement some of that wisdom. We want to have online excellence, and when we get into our facility in a few weeks, we want to do this well. But I guess what is not concerning, but interesting, maybe concerning, and I don't think I'm the only one who shares this concern, is that out of all the great advice out there that we are getting bombarded with as, pastoral leaders, we're not really hearing a whole lot about this. Like, don't get me wrong, we need great internet. Don't get me wrong, we need great cameras. We need nice TVs. Like, we need all this. We need a great online platform and online strategy. Those are all good in their place. But I'm just not hearing a whole lot about this. And, there's a church guru. There's many. I'm not one of them. But there are many church experts out there who say a lot of different things. I was listening to a podcast, reading some of his material. One of these gurus, his name is Mark Sayers. He's a missiologist. He kind of studies kind of the mission of the church and the culture of the church in the 21st century. And he's coming to a bit of a different conclusion. And just so you know, Mark Sayers is the kind of person that other gurus will invite onto their podcasts and leadership seminars and conversations. So he's just not like a random voice. But he said something that really made me stop and think. He said that this pandemic, and I'm just kind of summarizing, will more than likely destroy what's left of, or most of what's left of, Christianity's place in culture. The phrase he uses is, it'll wipe out habitual Christians. That's a nice way of saying the crowd. There are people who are true blue born again believers. There are people who would say, Lord, take my time, take my talent, take my treasure, take my career, take my pension, take my hobbies. We're true blue believers, Lord. We're going to prioritize your kingdom above everything. And then there are also people who would say, look, I like God, I like church. And if you're watching, that's you. Honestly, we like you too. But they're not really sure about the commitment piece. And one of the things that COVID-19, he's saying, will do is that it will really evaporate a lot of the crowd. And in a context where the crowd is gone, in a context where there's not much left in terms of the remnants of Christianity, how do you advertise and market in an environment like that? And the question that he poses, and maybe the question I pose, is if all of this change helps us realize this, would that be a bad thing? If all of this change helps us realize that our souls need to be stirred by the word, is it such a bad thing? Now, it does presuppose something. It presupposes the answer to this question. Do you know what your soul really needs? We have 4 kids, 2, 4, 6, and 8. And our youngest 2 children, the 2-year-old and the 4-year-old, will tell you flat out exactly what they need. You never have to guess what they need. In fact, they'll come to me and they'll say, Daddy, and I'm going to go, yes, sweetie. I go, I need snuggles. In fact, our 2-year-old will say, Daddy, I need nuggles, because she can't say her S's. And when they ask, there's no shame, there's no embarrassment. In fact, there's usually a fight because they don't want to share Daddy, and so I got them on both laps, and then in my laps they're fighting each other. I'm like, no, girls, don't fight, But our older 2, the truth is they need snuggles as much as anybody else, but they don't always ask, and they want to, but it's because, and maybe you would agree with this, the older you get, the harder it becomes to communicate what you really need. Like, for example, you would never say out loud, I need someone to love me. Well, most people wouldn't. You would never say, I need someone to care for me. I need someone to value me. I need someone to protect me. But you think it, right? Maybe sometimes you even pray for it, but you would never voice it in front of others. And most people, including me, by the way, have this background fear of rejection, this background fear of disapproval, which makes it really hard to communicate what you really need. But I think the deep question is, do you know? Do you know what your soul needs? Like, we know what our bodies need for the most part. Good food, sleep, things of that nature. We even know what our minds need. In fact, my heart aches when I hear about the veterans who came back from World War I and World War II and how they succumb to a life of depression and alcoholism because of PTSD. My heart aches because today we know what their minds needed. They needed, the right therapy, the right counseling, the right medication, and a strong, stable, loving community. We know what your body needs. We know what our minds need. But the question is, do we know what our souls need? Because in this text, it was not an ordinary request. All the people came together and they told Ezra. I don't think they demanded it, but they knew what they wanted. They knew what they needed. They told Ezra, the teacher of the law, to bring out the book of the law. Now, this request came after they finished the wall, which took 52 days, which is a miracle. And there was more work to be done, but they had achieved something that they could be proud of. They saw the work of their hands, and they saw the wall that was complete. And they could rejoice in the fact that the walls were complete. But even as they looked at the complete wall around them, they recognized that there was an incompleteness in them. Have you felt the incompleteness in your soul? Maybe like these Jewish people, you've built something and you're really proud of it. You've built a life. You've built a career. Maybe you're in the middle of an advancing career and you are so pleased. Maybe it's not complete in the sense that there's nothing left to do, but it's complete in the sense that you know your life's direction. You see the money coming in. You see the projects materializing and things getting done. Maybe you're just so proud of the life you built or are building. You're proud of your career. Maybe it's your family. Maybe it's your children, and you just, when you look around you, you see completeness. But despite the completeness that's around you, do you sense the incompleteness in your soul? Do you sense that there's something missing? Because in this text, even though there was completeness around them before they did anything else, they made space for words of truth, life, and grace. And no one forced them. It wasn't a pastor encouraging them or begging them or pleading with them to pray or to be faithful. It was their decision. And it was all possible. This healing was possible because they made the decision to make space for words of truth, life, and grace. And I'm convinced that there's healing and restoration and renewal that's possible for you and your family. And I'm also convinced that it's on the other side of your decision to make space for the words of truth, life, and grace. This renewal that we read about, this restoration, this revival, if you will, was not forced top down from a human being to the masses. It was birthed from the ground up. And then something remarkable happened. They weren't just stirred by the words they heard, they received what they heard. They received what they heard. I read a New York Times article the other day. It was a 2017 article, but it's only 2020, so it's not that far from now. But the article said that the studies show that only 20 to 30% of prescriptions, 20 to 30% of prescriptions never get filled. And so 20 to 30% of those little slips the doctor give you just find their way into the trash. They never make it to the pharmacist. And what's even more surprising that I read in this article was that of the prescriptions, of the 70 to 80% of the prescriptions that do get filled, 50% of those prescriptions are not taken as prescribed, meaning the majority of people do not receive what they have heard. They do not receive the good advice that doctors have given them. And you're going to read this statement, you're going to struggle with this statement, and you're going to maybe think you disagree, but you're wrong, and I'm right. And it's not that I'm special, but you know it's true. We all know it's true. You're going to struggle with it, but it's true. Most of your problems, not all, but most, could have been avoided by applying simple advice in the past. And look, there are many things you can't control, but there are things you can control. Your health today, again, we don't know the future, but your health today is largely the byproduct of the decisions you made. You could have decided not to gorge on chips after supper. You could have decided not to have late night wings on a regular basis or McDonald's or whatever. Your health today, by and large, is the byproduct of the decisions you made over the past 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Even the health of your relationships is the byproduct of the investment you made over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And admitting that, maybe, just maybe, things could have been better takes vulnerability. That's why it's so hard to read this statement. It takes vulnerability to admit, yeah, you know what, I think you're right. Listening to words that matter takes vulnerability. And vulnerability is hard because of the fear of shame. There are a lot of reasons why it's hard to be vulnerable. I mean, it is not easy for anyone, me included, to admit you've made mistakes. It is not easy to admit what you're really feeling on the inside. It is not easy to admit that you're afraid of not fitting in. But at the root of a lot of those things is shame. Shame leads to the fear of being rejected. Shame leads to the fear of never belonging. Shame leads to the fear that you may never be truly accepted. And when you read this text, you can actually see or feel the vulnerability in their tears. Verse 9 says, This day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn or weep, for the people had been weeping as they listened to the words of the law. Well, they wept because they knew. It wasn't God's fault. It wasn't the government's fault. They couldn't blame it on their spouse or their kids. It was their fault. In fact, in the next chapter, they go and they confess their sins, not because they had to, but they just knew that before they could move forward, they needed to acknowledge what they had done. And so these were tears, not just of guilt, but they were tears of shame. And you have to be really careful with tears of shame, because where you bring tears of shame can intensify or wash away the blame. And even as you read this, maybe you're thinking to yourself, Pastor, I've actually learned this the hard way. I've brought my tears of guilt. I've brought my tears of shame to people who I thought would receive me, to people who I thought would accept me, to people who I thought would forgive me, but they didn't. In this text, I know it was Ezra who led the law, but it was really a response to the word of God, which is really a response to God himself. They brought their faults, they brought their failures, they brought their tears of guilt and their tears to someone who gave them freedom from their shame and their blame. And I believe with all my heart that God still wipes shame away today. Jesus took your shame. When we talk about his death as an excruciatingly painful experience, which it was also a shameful experience. He hung there likely naked, beaten beyond recognition for sins he did not commit. Why? To wipe away your sins, your guilt, and your shame. And so this passage in Nehemiah is a foreshadowing of Jesus wiping away your guilt, Jesus wiping away your shame, but they had to be vulnerable. They had to come. And before you come and receive, it takes vulnerability. In their case, their vulnerability actually preceded their celebration and the healing in their community. And it all started because their souls were stirred by the words they heard. And after their souls were stirred, they celebrated because of what they heard. Now that's kind of an odd transition, right? To go from vulnerability to tears of guilt, tears of shame, to literally in the same day celebrating. Now it's an odd transition because, in our context, when we have vulnerability, when we have tears of guilt, tears of shame, that usually leads to, deep conversation. Sometimes it leads to counseling, which is absolutely fantastic in the appropriate context. But in this case, it led to celebration. And it would be a mistake to think that this was just some sort of a religious party. It says in verse 18 that they celebrated the festival for 7 days. And on the 8th day, in accordance with the regulation, there was an assembly. Now, this festival, this whole 8-day experience was called the Festival of Tabernacles. And in this festival, they would make makeshift tabernacles or huts as a reminder of how God provided for them in the past. And for the first time in a long time, they had celebrated this festival the way it had intended to be celebrated. In fact, another version said that they had never celebrated with this much joy before. But this festival was really a celebrating of what God did back then. And so the question that I have is, well, what were they celebrating this time? What did God provide for them this time? Because when you read this whole book, while they're celebrating, the enemy was still at the gate. While the wall was repaired, the rest of the city needed a lot of work. Sure, it took 52 days to rebuild the wall, but for those of you who are parents, it can take 30, 40 years to raise responsible children. It can take months, if not years, if not decades, to establish a viable economy and trade routes and treaties with other nations. None of that really was in place. So what were they celebrating? Well, they were celebrating the compassion that God had given them for their faults and their failures, for the forgiveness that God was extending. They were celebrating the fact that they had a real home for the first time in a long time. A home that wasn't just bricks and mortar, but a home where they could be a community of people where they felt like they truly belonged. They were celebrating the fact that they knew that they knew that they knew they had a purpose. Their lives had meaning. And as we close today, I am convinced, I believe with all my heart, that God still provides forgiveness and compassion and provision and belonging and hope today. He offers these things through Jesus Christ to anyone who asks for it. But there is something that happened before they went from ruin to restoration. Their souls were stirred by the word they heard. But even before that, they had to do something that I believe with all my heart that you right now need to do. In fact, in this message, if you forget everything else, my hope and prayer is that you would remember what you're about to read, what I'm about to say, and that more than anything, you would just do it. Because I'm convinced that before your soul can be stirred by the word you need to hear, more than anything else, you have to make a move. You got to make a move. On the other side of the screen, I don't know if it's just one of you or three of you or a family, but I'm talking to you right now. In your faith right now, which maybe has become stagnant, you got to make a move. When I read in this book, in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 8, verse 13, something happened before they celebrated and they went out. They made a move. Verse 13 says this. We didn't read it, but here's what it says. On the second day of the month, the heads of all the families, along with the priests and the Levites, gathered around Ezra the scribe to give attention to the words of the law. The heads of the family made a move. I don't care if it's mom. I don't care if it's dad. I don't care if it's the husband or the wife. Someone in your community, someone in your home has to make a move. Someone has to make the decision and say, as for us and our house, we will build our lives. We will build our future on the God who is great, on the God who provides, on the God who heals, on the God who restores. And right now, you know it's you. I don't know how many people are on the other side of that screen right now, but you know it's you right now. You know beyond the shadow of any doubt, you got to make a move because you know that God has something in store for you. You know God has something in store for your spouse. You know God has something in store for your children, but you haven't made a move in a while. You haven't moved in your faith. This is your opportunity. This is your season to make a move. Even in this text, verse 15 goes on to say that they should proclaim this word and spread it throughout their towns and in Jerusalem. Go into the hill country. Go and proclaim. Go and declare. But before they went out, they went in. Before they had outreach, they had inreach in their own homes. In fact, there was so much inreach in their own homes that as family after family after family was restored, it changed a community and it changed a nation. And that's what became the message in the hill country. That's what became the message in the neighboring towns. And before you go out there, you got to make a move in your own home. And I believe with all my heart that for all the things that COVID-19 is, for all the things that we're learning in this pandemic, it is an opportunity by God for us, for you right now in your home to make a move, to start reestablishing your faith, to once again building your life on the Word of God and believing with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength that His promises for you and your loved ones are still good. But you got to make a move. You have to start preparing the way for your heart, soul, and mind to be stirred by the words of this book. You got to make a move. And even as we close and we sing this closing song, don't just sing words on a screen. If you're sitting there by yourself, don't just tune out right now. Don't just say, well, okay, I guess the message is done. Don't tune out. If you're sitting there with your family, don't just turn it off. Whether you're by yourself, whether you're with your loved ones, I'm inviting you. I'm imploring you. Make a move. Let the words of this song, let the words on the screen be more than just what you see. Let something be birthed in your heart. I believe with all my heart God is doing something in our church, in our community, even our city. And I don't think it's going to start top down. I believe that the Spirit of God, His presence will rise up from the people and we will see a move. But I'm asking us as a church to be a part of a larger movement. For us in our homes, in our marriages, in our individual contexts. This is your moment. This is your season to make a move. If we are to be a people, a church, a community of faith, both locally and abroad globally, if we are going to be a community that sees people move from ruin to restoration, we have to make a move. And this is your opportunity as we close.